The wagon creaked as it turned onto the narrow mountain path, its wheels sinking into the damp, uneven earth. Clara sat stiffly on the rough wooden bench, her linen bundle clutched so tightly her fingers had turned white. Her uncle sat beside her, his eyes fixed straight ahead, never once meeting hers. He had already said all he needed to say, or rather he had said nothing at all. Ahead, a crooked wooden gate marked the edge of the Whitaker ranch. The boards leaned under their own weight, their gray surface split and scarred by rain and wind. Beyond the gate, the land dropped into a hollow where the main house waited, half swallowed by morning fog. The roof sagged like a tired back, and the windows reflected nothing but the pale, washed-out sky. When the wagon stopped, Clara's uncle climbed down first. He didn't help her. She gathered her skirt, her knees weak, and stepped onto the wet earth. The cold rose up through her thin shoes, biting her ankles. She turned for a final look, but the wagon driver had already turned the horse, wheels lurching back down the path. Her uncle handed a small envelope to a tall figure on the porch, then climbed back into the wagon without a word. Clara felt her chest tighten as the wagon rolled away, swallowed by the mist. The figure on the porch remained still. A man in a long black coat, his hair slicked flat against his pale forehead. His face looked cut from stone, sharp lines, hollow eyes, a mouth set in permanent silence. Clara could not read anything in his stare. It was colder than the fog pressing at her back. She looked down at her bundle, fingers trembling, and stepped forward. Each step felt final, as if the earth beneath her feet might vanish if she turned back. When she reached the bottom step, she paused, her breath ragged in her throat. The man's hand flicked slightly, a small, impatient signal. She climbed the steps, her body obeying before her mind could resist. Behind her, the gate creaked in the wind, its sound thin and hopeless. By the time she crossed the threshold, Clara felt as though a heavy door had closed forever somewhere deep inside her. The door opened with a deep groan, like an animal forced awake. Clara followed Mr. Whitaker into the narrow hallway, her steps small and hesitant. The air inside smelled of cold ashes and something older, sour, impossible to name. Her bundle felt heavier with each step, as if it knew what waited for her. Mr. Whitaker moved ahead without a word, his boots thudding softly against the warped wooden floor. Lamps lined the walls, each flame thin and restless in its glass prison. Clara's eyes darted from shadow to shadow. Each corner seemed to breathe. He stopped near a row of hooks nailed into the wall. Only one hook held a garment, a pale blue dress, stiff and faded, like it had been waiting too long. Without turning, he spoke in a low, flat voice. "Silence after sunset. You work when told, no questions, no wandering." His words dripped out one by one, leaving no space for reply. Clara nodded quickly, her chin brushing her collarbone. Her mouth felt lined with dust. She tightened her hold on the bundle, hoping it might somehow shield her. Mr. Whitaker turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. In that moment, Clara felt as if her heart had fallen straight through the floor. His gaze was empty, not angry, not cruel, simply absent, like looking into a dried-up well. With a small flick of his wrist, he pointed down a narrow hallway to her right. She followed, moving past doors that seemed to lean inward, listening. At the far end, a small room waited. A cot stood against the wall, a thin, gray blanket folded sharply on top. A single metal basin sat in the corner, its surface dull. Mr. Whitaker stepped back, leaving her standing in the doorway. The hallway behind him seemed to darken as he retreated. His last words floated back like a final nail hammered into a coffin. "Lock the door at night, always." Then he was gone, swallowed by the deeper dark. Clara stepped inside, her feet numb. The door shut behind her with a soft click, a sound so small it felt enormous in the silence that followed. She pressed her forehead to the rough wall, her breath ragged, her pulse a slow, heavy drum. Here she was no longer a niece or a guest. Here she was something else entirely. Morning light barely touched the hallway when Clara stepped out of her room, her bundle pressed tight against her chest. The house felt like a mouth that had forgotten how to speak. Boards creaked under her feet. each sound a quiet confession in the heavy silence. At the far end of the hall, a woman moved in slow, careful steps. Her gray apron hung loose over a dark dress, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She carried a small tin bucket, eyes fixed on the floor, as if each plank might suddenly open beneath her. Clara opened her mouth to greet her, but no words came. The woman didn't look up, only shuffled past, her thin shoulders trembling. Beyond the woman, in a wider room that smelled faintly of old onions and soot, a man worked near a barrel. His back bent, hands moving methodically as he scrubbed something unseen. His hat drooped low over his face, hiding his eyes. When Clara stepped forward, he paused for a moment, shoulders tightening, then continued without turning. The air around him felt like a closed door. Clara moved closer to the window. The glass was streaked and cloudy, filtering the weak morning light into thin lines across the floor. Outside she could see the barn, its doors sealed with a thick crossbeam, and a stretch of brown, trampled earth that led toward the crooked gate. She heard a footstep behind her and turned sharply. The woman in the apron stood at the doorway now, hands clutching the bucket, head still down. Clara forced her voice up through her throat, but it came out like a broken reed. "Good morning." The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned and disappeared down another hallway, leaving a thin trail of wet footprints on the boards. Clara felt the greeting echo uselessly inside her, like a stone thrown into a dry well. She pressed her forehead to the glass, trying to breathe. The barn seemed to shiver in the fog, the fence line sharp as a blade. Each small movement in the yard felt like a secret she wasn't meant to know. Behind her, the house had already swallowed the other figures again, leaving only the sound of her own shallow breaths. Clara touched the window with her fingertips, the cold sinking straight into her bones. For a moment, she wished the glass would break and pull her through to whatever lay beyond. But the pain held firm, like the rest of this place, silent, watchful, and unyielding. That evening, as the last gray light drained from the sky, Clara drifted through the narrow hallways, her steps soft and unsure. Shadows clung to the corners, shifting with every flicker of the weak oil lamps. Somewhere deeper in the house, she heard a chair scrape and a door shut, the sound sharp and final. She passed the kitchen again. The woman in the apron was bent over the stove, her back tense. Steam rose in thin, pale threads, curling into the dim rafters. Clara paused at the doorway, but the woman never turned or acknowledged her presence. The silence between them felt as thick as wool, choking any word before it could form. Drawn by an anxious curiosity she couldn't suppress, Clara turned toward the barn. She stopped at a window at the end of the hallway, the glass warped and cold under her palm. The barn loomed in the mist, its wooden doors sealed tight with a heavy crossbeam. Above it, a dim lantern swung slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. In that half-light, she thought she saw something move behind the barn, a thin shape, quick and pale, slipping into the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed closer to the glass, her forehead touching the icy surface. But the shape vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, swallowed by fog and dark. Her pulse drummed painfully against her ribs. She stepped back, her hand trembling on the window frame. She felt watched, not by the house or the man, but by something older, something threaded into the walls and earth itself. A sudden sound behind her made her flinch. Mr. Whitaker stood at the far end of the hall, his black coat hanging like a shadow around him. His eyes, two small, pale voids, fixed on her. She didn't know how long he had been standing there, silent and patient. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The message in his gaze pressed into her skin like iron. Clara lowered her eyes at once, her throat tight. Slowly, she stepped away from the window and turned back down the hall, her bundle clutched to her chest as if it might still protect her. She felt him watching her the entire way back to her small room. Each step felt heavier, as if the house itself had taken hold of her ankles. When she reached her door, she slipped inside quickly and closed it behind her, her fingers locking around the handle until they ached. Outside, the hallway went silent again. Clara pressed her back against the wall, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Somewhere beyond the walls, the barn creaked softly in the night fog. In her mind, the thin shape moved again and again, slipping between the dark trees, waiting, watching. The next evening, Clara sat on the edge of her narrow cot, staring at her bare feet on the cold floor. The thin blanket lay crumpled beside her, offering no warmth. Her hands trembled against her knees, each breath shallow, tasting of rust and dust. Outside her small window, the last strip of daylight withered into deep gray. The barn loomed beyond, a dark bulk against the dying sky. Fog curled between the trees like silent fingers. A sudden pulse of defiance rose inside her. Sharp, surprising, almost alien. Before she could think, she stood and pulled her shawl around her shoulders, stepping toward the door. Her hand hovered over the latch, her fingers twitching. She pushed it open. The hallway felt thicker at night, each shadow stretching long and slow across the boards. She moved like a moth, drawn by something she didn't understand. Down the hall, past the hooks on the wall, past the kitchen's cold hearth. When she reached the back door, her hand hesitated. She pressed her ear against it first, listening. Nothing, only the wet breathing of the fog outside. She stepped out. The earth was soft under her bare feet, sinking slightly with each cautious step. The air bit at her skin, sharp and wet. She kept her bundle pressed tight to her chest, though she no longer knew why. She moved toward the fence line, eyes darting to the barn. Its door stood silent, the heavy crossbeam in place. The small lantern above it swayed gently, casting a thin glow across the mud. Suddenly she felt a weight slam into her shoulder, a hand clamped down, fingers like iron hooks. She gasped, twisting around, and saw Mr. Whitaker's pale face above her, his eyes blank and endless. He didn't speak. He dragged her backward, his grip unyielding. Her feet slid through the mud, her bundle falling and bursting open, scraps of cloth and a single hair ribbon sinking into the dirt. Inside, he pushed her into the hallway, the door slamming shut behind them. His silence roared louder than any shout. He turned her roughly, his hands pinning her shoulders against the wall. She could feel his breath on her neck, cold, deliberate. For a moment, she thought he might speak, might reveal something human beneath that stone mask. But he only stared at her, eyes close and unblinking. Then he stepped back. With a single sharp motion, he pointed toward her room. Clara stumbled down the hall, her legs weak as reeds. When she reached her door, she fell inside and crawled to the cot, her fingers clawing at the thin blanket as if she might disappear into it. Behind her, she heard the slow, deliberate footsteps fade into the house. Her breath shook through the darkness. Outside, the fog pressed against the window like a silent witness waiting. Dawn crawled into the room like a pale, unwelcome guest. Clara lay on her cot, her eyes wide and raw from a night without sleep. Every creak of the house had felt like a threat, each gust of wind against the boards a reminder of the silent grip she could not escape. When she finally rose, her legs trembled beneath her. The hallway beyond her door was empty, the air damp and heavy. She pressed her palm to the wall, steadying herself, and felt the chill seep into her bones. Today, she told herself, she would try again. The thought sounded foolish even inside her own head, but it pulsed through her anyway. A dull, defiant drumbeat. She crept toward the main door, each step measured and slow. Her bare feet barely touched the floorboards, her breath shallow as she passed the hooks on the wall, the silent kitchen, the half-closed storage room. At the door, her hand found the latch. For a moment she hesitated, her mind flashing with the memory of Whitaker's cold stare and the iron grip on her shoulders. But she pushed forward, slipping into the morning fog. The yard was slick with dew and churned mud. She stepped carefully, her thin dress clinging to her knees. The gate felt impossibly far. She reached the first fence post when a sudden shape loomed in the corner of her eye. She turned sharply. The stable hand stood there, shovel in his hand, blocking the narrow gap between her and freedom. He didn't speak. His face was empty, eyes sunken and tired, as if he'd been waiting for her all along. The shovel blade pressed into the mud, a silent barrier more powerful than any words. Behind her, the barn doors remained closed. The ranch felt smaller than ever, the fog pressing down like a heavy blanket. Clara stepped back, her knees weakening. She felt the presence before she heard it, Mr. Whitaker's quiet, measured steps behind her. She turned slowly, her heart thundering so loudly it drowned out the morning birds. His eyes locked on hers, and she knew there would be no second chance today. Without a word, he pointed to the porch. Clara stumbled toward it, her breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. On the porch, he handed her a bucket and an old, stiff brush. With a simple nod, he directed her to her knees. The porch boards were rough, splinters biting into her skin as she knelt. She began to scrub, her fingers raw within minutes. Each stroke smeared dirt and old blood deeper into the grain. Hours slipped by unnoticed, the pain in her knees fusing with the ache in her arms and the emptiness in her chest. When the sun climbed higher, her hands were cracked and bleeding, tiny lines of red pooling on the boards. Whitaker watched from the shadow of the doorway, unmoving. Clara didn't look up. She worked until her mind blurred, until she no longer felt the wind or heard the cries of crows circling above. Only when the bucket was empty and her fingers refused to move did she dare to pause. She leaned forward, forehead pressed to the wet wood, and let a single shuddering breath slip from her lips. Above her, Whitaker's figure shifted slightly, but he said nothing. The silence felt endless, as heavy as the mountain itself. That night, Clara lay curled on her cot, her hands wrapped in strips of old linen she had torn from her hem. Each movement sent tiny shocks of pain through her fingers and wrists. The scent of her own blood and the sharp tang of old wood filled the room, pressing against her ribs like a second skin. She listened to the slow creaks of the house, each one echoing through her like a quiet warning. Somewhere deep beyond her door, she heard the steady rhythm of footsteps, heavy, deliberate. She pressed deeper into the thin blanket, trying to disappear. Suddenly, the door handle turned. Clara froze, her breath trapped in her chest. The door inched open, revealing a narrow slice of the hallway beyond. In the dim glow of the single lamp, the maid's face appeared, pale, hollow-eyed, her hair tied back in a loose knot. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the maid slipped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. She stepped forward, her bare feet whispering over the floorboards. Clara sat up, her eyes wide, her pulse crashing in her ears. The maid held out her hand, and in it was a small, folded scrap of cloth. Clara hesitated, then reached out with shaking fingers to take it. The fabric felt damp and cold, and as she unfolded it, she caught a faint scent of old iron, the unmistakable scent of blood. "She tried," the maid whispered, her voice so thin it felt like it might vanish before reaching Clara's ears. "She tried to run. They always do." Clara's throat tightened. Her eyes darted to the cloth again. There, in one corner, she saw a small embroidered initial, almost hidden in the frayed edge. A name she didn't know, a ghost sewn into the threads. The maid's hands twitched at her sides as though she wanted to say more, but the words were trapped behind her teeth. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to Clara. "You must be careful," she breathed, so softly it felt more like a breeze than a voice. "He watches, always." Then, without waiting for a reply, she turned and slipped back into the hallway, closing the door behind her with the same quiet care. Clara sat there, the cloth clutched in her bandaged hands. She felt the walls press in around her, the air tightening until her head spun. Somewhere beyond the room, the barn groaned against the night wind, the echo twisting through the dark halls like a long, low moan. She held the scrap against her chest, her body shaking, her mind grasping at fragments of courage and terror in equal measure. In that moment, she realized the house was not only a prison, it was a grave for those who had tried before. Morning arrived, gray and cold, a thin drizzle tapping at the window like nervous fingers. Clara's hands throbbed under the linen wraps, each movement a small battle. She sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the folded cloth from the maid, the embroidered initial staring back like a silent witness. A heavy knock broke her trance. The door swung open before she could answer. Mr. Whitaker stood in the doorway, his coat hanging around him like a black shroud. In his right hand he held a small knife, its edge dulled but still sharp enough to glint in the pale light. He motioned for her to stand. Clara obeyed, her legs trembling so badly she nearly fell. He gestured to the center of the room, and she shuffled forward, her arms tight around her ribs. Without a word, he stepped behind her and seized a fistful of her hair. She gasped, the sudden pull jerking her head back. He brought the knife close to her scalp, and she felt the cold kiss of the metal against her skin. Strands fell around her feet, clumps landing on her shoulders before sliding to the floor like dead crows. Each cut felt like a silent accusation, stripping her of something she hadn't even known she was still holding on to. When he finished, he dropped the knife onto the cot and stepped back, examining her with a blank, clinical stare. Clara dared not move, dared not look at the pile of hair at her feet. Her scalp stung, raw and exposed, the air against it sharp and humiliating. He left the room without a sound, leaving the door ajar. Clara stumbled to the basin in the corner, her reflection shivering in the shallow water. The girl staring back looked hollow, her eyes too large, her hair a ragged, uneven halo around her pale skull. Her sewing kit, once her only comfort, was missing from the small shelf beside the basin. The space where it had sat looked empty in a way that made her chest ache. She searched the floor, her fingers tracing the boards as if the kit might be hiding in the cracks. But it was gone. Outside the window, the barn door shifted slightly in the breeze, the crossbeam creaking. She pressed her forehead to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. She felt the walls closing in tighter with each heartbeat. The cloth scrap still lay on the cot, its corner curling like a withering leaf. Clara picked it up again, her fingers numb, and pressed it to her chest. Her mind churned in small, frantic circles, every path leading to the same dark dead end. She sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chin, her newly shorn head resting against the cold wall. Outside, the drizzle thickened into steady rain, each drop tapping like distant footsteps she could no longer ignore. That night, the rain beat against the house in sharp, restless waves. Clara lay awake on her cot, the thin blanket twisted around her legs. The rough stubble on her scalp prickled against the pillow, each contact a reminder of her forced submission. She stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks that snaked across it like veins under pale skin. Each creak of the roof sounded like a whisper, an echo of voices that had been swallowed long before her arrival. Unable to bear the stillness, she rose and shuffled across the room. Her fingers, still sore and wrapped in linen, fumbled along the floorboards near the bed. One of them shifted slightly under her touch. Her breath caught. She pressed harder, and with a quiet groan the board gave way just enough for her to slip her fingers underneath. She pulled it up, revealing a narrow, dusty space below. Inside, a bundle of cloth lay folded, heavy with dampness. Clara lifted it carefully, her heart thudding in her throat. She unfolded the bundle and gasped. A blue dress, its fabric stiff and stained with dark brown smudges, as though it had been dragged through mud or something far worse. The sleeves were torn at the seams, and the hem looked as if it had been ripped in a frantic struggle. She held it to her nose and inhaled. The smell of earth, sweat, and something metallic filled her lungs, making her stomach twist. Underneath the dress she found a small, cracked hair comb, its teeth broken and stained. A single pale hair still clung to it, ghostly and thin. Clara sank to her knees, the dress draped over her arms like a fallen body. In that moment, she saw it all clearly. The vanished girl, the hidden struggle, the quiet erasure. She wasn't the first to stand in this room, to breathe this same damp air, to stare at the barn door through a fogged window and dream of escape. She pressed her forehead to the fabric, her tears soaking into the old stains. The room seemed to pulse around her, each wall bending inward, pressing closer with a quiet, suffocating intent. Her fingers curled into the dress as though she could wring out an answer, a promise of freedom, some sign that it wasn't too late. But the cloth only shivered in her hands, lifeless and silent. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes burned with a new clarity. A sharp, fragile spark of resolve pushed against the heavy fog in her mind. She folded the dress again, carefully, and slipped it back under the floorboard, pushing it down as though burying a body. As she lowered the plank into place, her breath came out shaky and uneven. Standing, she felt the air shift inside her, a cold current moving through her bones. Clara turned toward the door, her fingers brushing the edge lightly. Outside, the rain drummed on, steady and indifferent, as if marking time for the ghosts trapped inside the walls. Morning broke slow and sullen, the rain reduced to a soft drizzle that clung to the glass like a thin veil. Clara sat on the edge of her cot, her fingers tracing the rough bandages at her wrists. The hidden dress still echoed in her thoughts, its weight pressing down with every heartbeat. She rose, her legs stiff, and moved toward the small storage cupboard near the kitchen. Each step felt heavy, as though she carried the whole house on her shoulders. The kitchen smelled of cold ashes and old onions. She paused in the doorway, listening. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, almost staged. She opened the cupboard slowly, careful not to let the hinges groan. Inside, beneath a pile of folded rags, she saw something small and pale. Her fingers trembled as she reached in and pulled it free. It was a hair ribbon, thin, frayed at the edges, its original color bleached to a faint gray blue. Tiny, careful stitches ran along the edge, forming initials almost too faint to read. She leaned closer, her breath warming the fabric. The initials matched the letter sewn into the cloth scrap the maid had given her. A sudden wave of nausea rose in her throat. Clara gripped the ribbon, her mind spiraling. She saw the girl in the dress, felt her running barefoot across the mud, the ribbon slipping from her hair. She saw hands catching her, dragging her back. A silent struggle, the same walls watching in mute complicity. A creak behind her snapped her head around. The maid stood at the far end of the hallway, her eyes wide and hollow. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Then, slowly, the maid lowered her gaze and turned away, her shoulders caving inward like a wilted flower. Clara turned back to the ribbon, pressing it against her lips as if it could lend her the strength of its last owner. The fragile fabric felt alive in her hands, pulsing with the memory of escape, a memory that had been silenced before it could be finished. She tucked the ribbon inside her dress, close to her skin. The house felt different now, as if every door had shifted slightly, as if every board had learned her name. She backed out of the cupboard, her eyes scanning the shadows. Each hallway seemed longer, each doorway darker. The barn outside looked even more distant, its doors still barred like a mouth sealed against confession. Her pulse rose, hot and fast. She felt the walls lean closer, listening. She stepped away from the kitchen, moving lightly down the hall, her fingers brushing along the wall for balance. In that moment, she no longer saw the house as a shelter or even a prison. It was a labyrinth designed to swallow her slowly, to bury her story as it had buried the others. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the ribbon hidden there, and took a slow, trembling breath. For the first time, the cold fear twisting in her gut began to harden into something sharper, something with edges, something like resolve. The sky that evening bruised into deep purple and gray, the last of the drizzle turning to a thin mist that hung low across the yard. Inside the house, Clara moved quietly, her ears tuned to every groan of the floorboards, every shiver of the draft beneath the doors. The maid passed her in the hallway, a bundle of linens clutched to her chest. Their eyes met briefly, the maid's gaze sharp and urgent, her lips trembling with words she seemed too afraid to speak aloud. Later, as Clara sat on her cot, knees pulled to her chest, she heard a gentle knock at the door. Her heart stilled. Before she could respond, the maid slipped inside, closing the door behind her with practiced caution. In her hand, she held a small iron key, its teeth dull and worn from use. She looked at Clara with a trembling intensity, her whole body quivering as though each breath might be her last. She stepped forward and pressed the key into Clara's palm. Her hands felt cold and fragile, bird-bone delicate. "North Trail," she whispered, the words so thin they barely reached Clara's ears. "Before first light, only then. He watches all other hours." Clara looked down at the key, its cold bite sinking into her skin. A shudder tore through her chest. She lifted her eyes, wanting to thank her, to ask 1,000 questions. But the maid only shook her head sharply, her eyes darting to the door. "Don't trust the stable hand," she breathed, her voice cracking. "He obeys." Always. The maid's fingers hovered over Clara's hair for a moment, as though she might touch her, comfort her, but she pulled back quickly, as if burned. Then she turned and slipped through the door, vanishing into the hallway's dark mouth. Clara sat motionless, staring at the key in her palm. It felt impossibly heavy, as if it contained all the stories of the girls before her, all the failed escapes, all the swallowed cries. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts. She pressed the key to her lips, feeling the rough iron scrape her skin. A single tear slid down her cheek, leaving a cold track to her chin. She rose, her legs shaking, and moved to the window. The barn stood silent in the mist, the crooked gate beyond it barely visible in the low light. In that moment, Clara felt the walls press closer, the entire house leaning forward to listen. But in her chest, under her ribs, something stubborn and bright flickered. The echo of all those girls, a quiet chorus urging her to move, to fight, to run. She closed her fingers tightly around the key, her jaw set. Tomorrow, before first light, only then. Outside, the mist curled around the barn and drifted toward the gate, as if leading her forward into the dark unknown. Clara barely slept that night. She sat on the cot with her back pressed hard against the wall, her knees pulled tight to her chest. The key dug into her palm, leaving small red lines in her skin. Every creak of the house felt amplified, every gust of wind against the walls a reminder of how thin the barrier was between her and discovery. When the hallway finally fell silent, she moved, slowly, deliberately. She unwound the bandages from her hands, wrapping them instead around the small bundle of crumbs she had stolen from the kitchen. Crusts of bread, a few cold scraps. Her fingers trembled, not from pain now, but from the feverish energy burning beneath her skin. She slipped to the door, pressing her ear against it. Nothing. The air on the other side felt thick and waiting. She stepped out, each footfall measured, her breath held as though even air might betray her. Down the hallway, past the dark kitchen where the maid's eyes had once flicked toward her in warning, past the hooks where the blue dress had once hung, accusing and silent. She paused by the northern window, the one she had watched so many times. The mist outside was dense tonight, swirling low against the ground, curling like a living thing. She let her forehead rest against the glass, her breath blooming into pale circles. Her fingers clenched tighter around the key. She slipped it into her mouth, hiding it beneath her tongue as the maid had instructed. The iron tasted sharp and bitter, cutting against her teeth. She turned and pressed onward. The boards creaked softly beneath her feet, each small sound booming in her mind like thunder. She counted each breath, each heartbeat as she neared the door. At the entryway, she crouched beside the threshold, her body trembling. She pressed her fingers into the grain of the wood, memorizing the edges, as though anchoring herself to something real before stepping into the unknown. She could almost feel the walls leaning closer, listening. The house seemed to hold its breath with her. She looked back once. The hallway stretched into darkness, the shadows curling and shifting as if they might reach for her if she waited too long. She rose, sliding the key from her mouth, her lips numb from its cold. With one final shuddering breath, she slipped it into the lock. The faintest click echoed around her, louder than a scream. The door inched open. A damp gust swept over her face, pulling at the hem of her thin dress. She felt it, that small flicker of freedom, sharp and alive in her lungs. She stepped out, the mud cold under her bare feet, the mist swallowing her figure almost instantly. Behind her, the house stood silent and patient, like a creature watching from the shadows. Clara didn't look back. Each footstep into the wet grass felt like tearing through 1,000 invisible threads, each one holding her to that house, that room, that man. She pressed onward into the fog, her fingers tight around the crumbs. the key still warm from her mouth, her heart pounding its frantic, desperate hymn into the waiting dark. Clara pushed forward, her breath ragged in the cold mist. The ground sucked at her feet with every step, mud and wet grass clawing at her skin. The bundle of crumbs felt small and ridiculous in her hand, but she held it as if it might keep her alive one more moment. Beyond the barn, the northern trail appeared at last, a narrow path that twisted between crooked pines and disappeared into the dark slopes beyond. Her pulse hammered against her ribs, each beat screaming, "Go, go, go!" She reached the gate. Her fingers fumbled at the latch, slick with sweat and rain. The world around her seemed to shrink to that single rusted hinge. She forced her breathing to slow, her mind to steady. Then a sound behind her, a single careful footstep. She spun. Mr. Whitaker stood a few paces away, a long knife hanging loosely in his right hand. The blade glimmered dully in the weak moonlight, its edge dark with rain. His face looked the same as always, pale, expressionless, hollow-eyed, but tonight something sharp moved behind his eyes. They stared at each other across the mud, neither moving, neither speaking. The silence stretched until it felt like the earth itself might crack. Then he stepped forward. Clara's body jolted into motion before her mind caught up. She turned toward the trail, but his hand closed on her wrist like a steel trap, spinning her around. She lashed out, her nails raking across his cheek, drawing thin lines of red. He didn't flinch. His free hand rose, shoving her backward. She stumbled, her bare feet slipping in the mud. The knife glinted again as he raised it. She grabbed for anything, a rock, a branch, but found only slick grass and her own failing strength. His arm swung down. At the last instant, she lunged forward, driving her body into his. The impact knocked them both sideways, and they crashed into the fence post. His grip loosened for a breath. Clara's hand found the key in her pocket. Sharp, heavy, a final chance. Without thinking, she drove it upward into the soft hollow of his neck. A wet, choking sound burst from him. His eyes widened, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. His fingers clawed at her shoulder, then fell away, his body slumping into the mud. She staggered back, her lungs burning, her dress clinging to her skin like a second suffocating layer. For a moment, she could only watch as he gurgled and writhed, his life seeping into the earth around them. Then she turned. The gate yawned open before her, the trail beyond vanishing into blackness. Her whole body screamed to run, to vanish before the house could awaken and swallow her again. She lunged forward, her steps heavy and wild. Behind her she heard a final gasp, then only the soft patter of rain on leaves. Clara did not look back. The trail bent and narrowed ahead, but it felt wider than any road she had ever seen. Each step sent pain slicing up her legs, but she kept moving, driven by a terror now fused with a strange, trembling flame of hope. Somewhere in the dark the mountain waited, and beyond it, something that might one day be called freedom. Clara plunged into the narrow mountain trail, her breath coming in ragged bursts that ripped through the quiet like torn cloth. Branches slapped at her arms and face, leaving thin red lines across her skin. Her bare feet sank into cold mud and slipped over slick roots, but she did not slow. Behind her, the yard disappeared into a pale swirl of fog and moonlight. The house seemed to fade into the trees, but she felt its eyes on her still, heavy and patient, waiting for her to falter. She pressed her fingers to her side where the key had been. Now it was gone, left buried in the man's throat, the final barrier broken. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a strange mix of horror and savage relief. The forest thickened. The trees loomed tall and twisted, their trunks slick with moss, their branches grasping at her hair. Every rustle, every crack of a twig sounded like footsteps behind her. Her mind conjured him there, his pale face, his hollow stare, his hands closing around her throat. She stumbled and fell forward, her knees slamming into a tangle of wet roots. Pain shot up her legs, and for a moment the world tilted and blurred. Her fingers clawed into the dirt, pulling her forward inch by inch until she managed to rise again, trembling. Through the mist, a thin glow appeared ahead, moonlight breaking through the branches, spilling onto a rocky clearing. She forced her body toward it, each step a violent argument with her own fear. At the edge of the clearing, she paused, her whole body shaking so hard she nearly collapsed. She looked back once, her eyes wide and wild. The path behind her was empty, a tunnel of fog and branches. No figure appeared. No hand reached out. Only the hush of wind and the distant call of an owl broke the silence. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting a sob that tore at her throat. Tears blurred her vision as she staggered forward into the clearing. Above her, the sky stretched open, wide and endless for the first time in what felt like years. The moon hung low and bright, casting silver over her torn dress, and the mud streaked across her arms. She fell to her knees in the center of the clearing, her hands sinking into the cold, wet earth. Her whole body buckled, and she let out a strangled cry that cut into the night air like a blade. She did not know if she was screaming in triumph, grief, or terror, perhaps all of them at once. In that moment, she felt both smaller and more alive than she had ever been. Each breath tasted like rust and pine needles, sharp and real. Clara raised her head to the sky, her face streaked with blood and tears. The moonlight washed over her, silent and indifferent, as though it had always been waiting to witness her final rupture. Her chest heaved as she knelt there, alone under the open sky. Somewhere deep inside, the fragile ember of something, freedom maybe, flickered to life, too faint to trust, yet too stubborn to die. At first light, the sky above the clearing shifted from deep indigo to a dull, bruised gray. Clara lay curled in the mud, her breath thin and shallow, her dress clinging to her like a wet shroud. Her fingers twitched against the cold earth as if searching for something solid to hold on to. When she finally pushed herself upright, every bone felt splintered, every muscle raw and foreign. Her head throbbed, the edges of her vision clouded with pale spots. But she rose, slowly, unsteadily, she rose. She turned her face toward the slope that led down into the valley. The mist still clung to the trees below, but beyond it, just visible in the breaking light, lay a distant line of meadows and fields. A world she had almost forgotten existed. Clara stumbled forward, each step a small war against the pull of gravity and exhaustion. Her bare feet slid over moss and rocks, leaving thin streaks of blood where sharp edges caught her skin. She no longer carried the bundle of crumbs. Somewhere along the trail, it had slipped from her grasp, swallowed by the night and fog. But now she barely noticed its absence. Her focus narrowed to the simple act of moving, of putting space between her and that house. As she neared the edge of the forest, a faint wind rose from the valley. It carried the scent of wet grass and smoke from distant fires, smells so ordinary they nearly broke her. She reached a patch of short, flattened grass and fell to her knees, her hands splayed out in front of her. A sharp sob tore through her chest, echoing into the morning air. It was not a cry of triumph, but of something deeper, a raw, unformed ache for all she had lost, for all she had become. Her face pressed into the ground, the cool blades of grass against her cheek. Her body convulsed with silent cries, her fingers clawing at the earth as if trying to root herself to something that would not disappear beneath her. When her sobs finally subsided, she sat up slowly, her eyes swollen, her hair sticking in damp tufts to her skull. She looked down at her hands, scraped, bloodied, trembling, and pulled them to her chest, curling around them like a child. The valley below shimmered in the morning haze, a patchwork of soft greens and silver streams. It looked impossibly distant, yet it was there, solid and real. Clara forced herself to her feet once more. She took a step forward, then another. Each movement felt like it might tear her apart, yet each one carried her farther from the silent rooms, the locked doors, the cold eyes. She did not know if safety waited beyond the hills, or if another kind of cage might find her there. But she knew she could not turn back. As she descended, the light grew stronger, catching on her torn dress and the raw lines of her skin. The house on the mountain faded into a memory, a wound that would never truly heal, but one she would carry beyond the trees. With each step, her breath steadied, and somewhere deep in her chest, the ember of life, fragile and wounded, flickered stubbornly on. And so she went on, into the valley, into the unknown, her body broken but moving forward, her spirit scarred but unextinguished.